In the previous lesson, we have stopped at the point where we could control value of the select box element. But we also faced a different issue, which is when we try to reset the value by clicking on this button. In Vue DevTools, we can see that the appropriate variable with the name selected activity ID was reset and assigned the null value. But this was not reflected in the UI, and we still can see selected value in the select box. So let's try to figure out what is going on. Let's open up component base select, scroll down to the option element, and here let's focus on the selected attribute. And based on the value of the selected prop that we pass into this component, that also determines which option should be selected, we can try to bind an expression to this selected attribute. We're gonna check if selected property is equal to null, and in this case, this default option with a placeholder should be pre-selected, in cases when no other option is selected. And let's test it out. Let's pick a different value in this select box, then click on the reset button, and this time the select value was reset and we see default label with text rest. And now let's see what happens if we will not set initial value to reactive variable selected activity ID. In this case, its value will be equal to undefined. Then this value gets passed to base select component in selected property. And eventually that expression inside of selected attribute of the base select component will be evaluated to false, because undefined is not equal to null. So in this case, this option will not be selected by default. And this is a problem because instead of it, the first activity is selected, which is not what we need. And to avoid such situations, we're gonna add one more check in here, which will compare selected variable with undefined. And now whether selected property is equal to null or undefined, the first option of the select box will always be pre-selected by default. And indeed, we see that the option with default label rest was selected. And actually this check seems quite big to keep it in the template. So in order to avoid such expressions and keep templates lean, we can always extract such chunks of logic into separate variables. So we're gonna create new variable with the name isNotSelected. And then let's scroll up to script tag. Here we're gonna create constant with the name isNotSelected. And for this variable, we're gonna use another Vue.js concept called computed properties. It is created like so. Firstly, we call function with the name computed, which will soon import from the Vue package. This function accepts closure where our custom logic for this property will reside. And this logic will produce value for our computed property. But most importantly, this closure will rerun every time whenever one of the reactive properties used inside of this closure will change. In this case, we're using one reactive property called selected, which by the way we need to fetch from props object. Anytime we refer to props within script tag of the component, we should refer to them via an object. Usually it is called props, and this object we should get from define props call. So firstly, let's go up and write an import for computed function from the Vue package. And then in here, where we call define props macro, we're gonna assign result of this call to props constant. And this props object is gonna contain all properties of this component. And back to our computed property is not selected. So the closure defined here within computed function will rerun anytime when selected property will change. And this way new value will be derived for our isNotSelected property. So we don't need to manually keep track of changes within selected property to keep value inside of isNotSelected variable up to date, because magic of computed properties will do it for us. Let's modify value of the select box element, then reset this value. After this select box element still shows default label rest, and this is intended behavior. So our computed property isNotSelected works as expected. And let's take a closer look at this line. It is actually can be considered a validation logic. So we can easily extract this part into a separate validator function. Let's call this function isUndefined or null. And the value that we're going to validate will pass as a param into this function. It is our selected prop. And now we'll go inside of validators.js. Somewhere in here, we're gonna declare an expert new function with the name is undefined or null. This function will accept one parameter. And let's replace mentions of props selected with this param name, value. And now let's go back to base select component. Let's place this computed property on one line and import this custom validator function above. We just need to add this function name to an import statement, which already imports another validation function, like so. And now let's take a look at another validation, which we apply to custom event with the name select. Every time we change value inside of select box, our component fires event with the name select. And along with this event, it will also send currently selected value as a payload. And this validation function tells us that this payload should be a number. But what will happen if we try to reset value of the select box? Because in that case, this payload will be null. So this validation will fail. Let's check it out. I'm gonna choose different value in this select box, then reset this value, and in console we see a warning. So event validation failed for an event with the name select. So that validation check that we have for this select event is not going to work anymore, because we also have to allow null values as a payload, since whenever we reset value of the select box, the payload of this select event will be equal to null. So we're going to create another validation function, which we'll call isNumber or null. And this function will allow all numbers as well as null values. So let's add a third entry to this import statement, function with the name isNumber or null, and then open up validators file and declare this function. Let's put it right under the isUndefined or null function. Here we paste that check. And additionally, we should add another check which will compare this variable with null. Also, let's not forget and specify one parameter in this function with the name value. And also notice that inside of this function, as well as inside of previous function, we have two exact expressions that compare value with null. So in order to not repeat ourselves, we can extract this expression into separate function, which we can call isNull. Since all this function will do is to compare input value with null value. In the same way, we're gonna declare new function with the name isNull, paste that expression, and specify one param with the name value. And after this, within isUndefined or null function, we have another minor inconsistency. Here in the first part of this expression we use custom function to check value, and in the second part we use operator directly. So this function technically has two different levels of abstractions, and we will try to bring it to only one level of abstraction. To do so, we're gonna extract this logic into its own function with the name isUndefined, and also to align the logic inside of this function with the function name, we're gonna reorder these two checks. And down below, let's copy over function isNull, paste new function with the name isUndefined. And we're gonna compare this value with undefined. Let's continue bringing up our validation functions to have one level of abstraction. So we're gonna extract this part into another validator with the name isNumber. As always, let's declare a new function isNumber and paste that check. Moving on, and let's scroll up to isTimelineItemValid function. Right here, the first part of this expression can be replaced with the function call isNumber. Let's do so. And as for the second part of this expression, it is not clear right away what kind of validation is happening in here. So we can create another function with a meaningful name to make this part of an expression more readable. In fact, what we are doing in here is we're checking if value of a certain variable is contained within specified range. So let's spell it out. We're gonna create function with the name isBetween. Let's scroll down a little bit. Here we're gonna create that function, paste here that logic we just got. And besides accepting the value in this function, we also have to accept start and the end of interval, since we need to know where the interval begins and where it ends. For this, let's add two more params with the name start and end. And then let's use these params in this expression. Now let's go up to that place where we call this function and pass all necessary params. First of all, we pass an hour that we're gonna validate. Then we pass beginning of range and the end of range. And also we're gonna make our range inclusive, so let's use operator less or equal to in here. And since in the future, in order to determine whether timeline object will be valid or not, we're gonna rely on more than just a simple check, which checks only our property of this object. We can also extract this line into a function with a readable name. For example, is our valid, which makes it clear what exactly we're validating in here. And by the way, this function can be a private function in this module, so while defining this function, we don't need to use export keyword. After that, let's scroll down to the last validation function. Here we use those expressions that were previously moved into separate function. So let's just replace these expressions with proper function calls. The second part of an expression we'll use is string function. And by the way, for this logic, we don't have a proper validator yet. So let's create this validation function right here, where we will simply check if the type of the passed value is a string. And for the second part of this expression, we have validator. It is called as number. So let's use that validation function and move this isString function closer to isNumber function. Place it right here. And isSelectOptionValid function, we're going to move closer to isNumber or null function. And eventually, after doing all this refactoring, it's time to finally check everything in the browser. Firstly, we're gonna check if our select boxes have desired behavior. As we can see, they all work as expected. And now let's check navigation. Let's click around in our application and see if we are redirected to the appropriate pages. And everything seems to be working fine. Even though our validation.js module has grown a lot, but now we have a bunch of custom validation functions, which we can use as many times as we need to validate properties and events, which in turn will make our code much safer and help us prevent a variety of bugs in the future.